When my wife told me I was too broke to host Thanksgiving, I stayed quiet. I let her laugh with her family, let them all mock me for being the poor man she married. What they didn't know was that, while they bragged about their mansions and luxury cars, I had already made a silent decision. The next day, instead of walking into her brother's mansion like she expected, I walked my entire family into a 5-star restaurant I had secretly rented out, just for us. That was the night everything changed. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story from? I love knowing where my viewers are tuning in across the world. Now, let's begin this story. I've never been the kind of man who needed a lot to be happy. Give me a hot cup of coffee in the morning, a solid day's work, and the peace of coming home to my own little corner of the world, and I was content. That's how I was raised. My parents were the type of people who believed in fixing things rather than replacing them, in saving rather than spending, and in finding joy in the small, simple moments of life. We weren't poor, not in the way some people mean it, but we weren't wealthy either. Every dollar in our household was earned through sweat and sacrifice, and that lesson stayed with me long after I grew up and left their home. I worked my way through college, sometimes holding down 2 jobs at once just to cover tuition and rent. When I finally landed a decent position in accounting at a mid-sized firm, I felt like I'd made it. Not because I was rolling in money, I wasn't, but because I was independent, standing on my own 2 feet, and building something for myself. Stability mattered more to me than showing off. I didn't drive the newest car, I didn't wear expensive watches, and I wasn't the kind of guy to spend hundreds of dollars on dinner just to take a photo for social media. That wasn't me. And then I met her, Melissa. Melissa came from a different world entirely. The first time I picked her up for dinner, I remember standing in awe in front of her parents' house. Calling it a house feels wrong even now. It was a mansion, all white stone and towering windows, with an iron gate that buzzed open only after a security guard checked your name against a list. Her father was a real estate developer, the kind of man who carried himself like he owned the city. Her mother was equally intimidating, flawlessly dressed, dripping in jewelry, and always ready with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Melissa herself was beautiful, no doubt about it, elegant in a way that made heads turn when she walked into a room. She had the kind of confidence that only comes from growing up knowing the world will bend for you. I won't lie, at first, I was intimidated. I felt out of my league, standing there in my off-the-rack shirt, while she wore a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But she laughed at my jokes, she listened when I talked, and for a while, it seemed like she didn't care that we came from such different backgrounds. In those early days, I thought our differences balanced each other. I admired her sophistication, and she said she admired my work ethic. I imagined we could meet in the middle, build a life that took the best of both worlds, her polish and my practicality. But as time went on, little cracks began to show. It started with comments, small at first, the kind you could brush off as jokes. If I suggested staying in to cook dinner, she'd roll her eyes and say, "That's cute, but who wants to eat pasta from a box when we could go somewhere nice?" If I told her about my plans to put more money into savings, she'd laugh. "You know, money is for enjoying too." My family always said, "If you don't spend it, what's the point of having it?" I tried to ignore it, but those words stuck with me. Slowly, I began to realize that to her, frugal was just another word for cheap. Her family didn't help either. Every time we went to visit, there was a sense of judgment hanging in the air, even if no one said anything directly. Her father would casually bring up property investments, knowing full well I didn't have the kind of money to play in that league. Her mother would comment on Melissa's designer outfits, then glance at my plain shirt as if silently asking what she was doing with me. I told myself love was enough, that we'd grow past these differences, but a part of me always felt like an outsider in her world. When we got married, things didn't exactly improve. Melissa's expectations of what married life should look like were shaped by her parents. She wanted the kind of home that was meant to impress, not just shelter. She wanted dinners at the newest restaurants, vacations in resorts, and holidays that looked like spreads from glossy magazines. I, on the other hand, wanted stability. I wanted to keep saving, keep building a safety net, keep living within our means. We argued more often than I care to admit. Not screaming matches, but quiet, simmering disagreements that left both of us frustrated. She thought I was holding us back from living, and I thought she was careless with money. For a while, I gave in more than I should have, telling myself that treating her to these things was worth the strain on my budget. But deep down, resentment was building. Thanksgiving was always one of those battlegrounds. For me, it was about tradition. My fondest memories were of my mom basting the turkey in the kitchen, my dad setting up extra chairs in the dining room, and the smell of pumpkin pie cooling on the counter. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, it was ours, and it felt like home. For Melissa, Thanksgiving was about presentation. She wanted the kind of gathering where people took photos of the table because it looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine. As November rolled around that year, the tension started again. Melissa's family group chat was already buzzing with plans. Her brother, Richard, bragged about the massive spread he was planning, complete with catering. Her sister, Evelyn, was talking about the custom floral arrangements she had ordered. Melissa's mother chimed in about how hosting is an art, not just a meal, and I could practically hear the smugness in her words. Melissa looked up from her phone one night and asked, "So are we hosting this year, or are we just going to Richard's?" I hesitated. I thought we'd keep it simple here. Cook together, have your parents over, maybe invite a few close friends. I think it would be nice. She raised an eyebrow. Simple? You mean small. You know my family. They'll expect more than just turkey and mashed potatoes in a dining room that barely fits 10 people. Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. I knew our house wasn't as big as her brother's. I knew we didn't have the kind of space to impress a crowd. But hearing her dismiss it so casually made my chest tighten. I just think Thanksgiving isn't about the size of the house or the price of the food, I said quietly. It's about being together. She gave a little laugh and shook her head. That's what broke people say. I froze. For a moment, I wondered if I'd misheard her. But no, she had said it, just like that. A casual jab, thrown out like it was nothing, but heavy enough to lodge in my chest like a stone. That night, as she scrolled through Pinterest boards of lavish table setups, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her words echoed in my head. That's what broke people say. Maybe to her, I was broke. Maybe to her, I'd never be enough, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I saved. But deep inside me, something shifted that night. A thought sparked in the quiet darkness, a thought that would grow stronger with every passing day. This Thanksgiving, things would be different. Thanksgiving was creeping closer, and in most families, that meant excitement. A buzzing in the air. Grocery lists. Children whispering about pumpkin pies and marshmallow-topped sweet potatoes. But in our house, the word Thanksgiving had a different flavor, more bitter than sweet. It had become a measuring stick, a contest, a spotlight that my wife loved to shine on other people's shortcomings. And in her eyes, the biggest shortcoming of all was me. It started one evening, right after dinner. I was rinsing the plates in the sink, letting the warm water run over my hands, while she leaned against the counter, scrolling on her phone with that distracted, dismissive look she often wore when she was half listening. "You know," she said casually, "my brother just sent pictures of his dining room. They already set up the table for Thanksgiving. Can you imagine? The table runner, the centerpiece, he had it all custom done. The chandelier reflected off the silverware. It looks like something out of a magazine." She smirked, not even bothering to glance at me. We could never pull off something like that in this little house. The way she said little house stung more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just an observation. It was a dagger. I dried my hands and leaned against the sink, trying to mask the hurt. "Thanksgiving isn't about chandeliers and centerpieces," I replied softly. "It's about family. About being together." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "That's something broke people say to make themselves feel better. Come on, you really think anyone in my family is going to care about togetherness when they're sitting at our tiny table with mismatched chairs? Don't embarrass yourself." Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking me slowly. I wanted to snap back, to tell her she was wrong, but part of me knew this wasn't new. It was just another verse in a song she'd been singing since we got married. The next night, she escalated. This time, it wasn't just between us. She put me on display. We were sitting in her parents' living room, a place that always felt like a museum, with pristine white couches that nobody dared to sit on too comfortably and glass coffee tables that reflected your every nervous gesture. Her parents, her sister, and her brother-in-law were all there. The TV was on, some football game in the background, but the real entertainment was always the conversation. "So," her mother said, sipping her wine, "where are we having Thanksgiving this year? Your brother has been hinting he'd love to host again. He's very proud of the new outdoor patio they added." Before I could even open my mouth, my wife chimed in. "Not at our place, that's for sure. You know he can't afford to host something like that. She tilted her head toward me, her voice dripping with amusement. What would we even serve? Store-brand cranberry sauce on a folding table? Laughter erupted around the room. Her sister covered her mouth, trying to stifle a giggle. Her father chuckled in that dismissive, I'm not even trying to hide my condescension way. And my wife, she sat back like she'd just delivered the punchline of the year. I forced a smile, though my insides twisted into knots. I think we'd manage just fine, I said quietly. But the words came out weak, drowned beneath the sound of their laughter. You'd manage? Her brother-in-law smirked. Come on, man. Hosting Thanksgiving isn't about just slapping some food on the table. It's about presentation, atmosphere. People remember that. And honestly, he glanced at my wife. You're better off letting the ones with the space and resources handle it. The words felt like an indictment, like a gavel slamming down. My wife nodded along, as though her family was simply speaking the truth I needed to hear. That night, as we drove home, the silence in the car was deafening. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Every red light felt like a moment to replay their laughter, her smirk, the pitying glances from her siblings. Finally, I asked, my voice barely steady, Did you have to say that? Did you have to make me look small in front of them? She sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were a child. You take everything so personally. It's not that deep. They were just joking. No, I said firmly. You were joking. At my expense. She didn't answer, just turned her face toward the window, her reflection blurred by the city lights streaming past. But her silence said more than any words could. It said she didn't care how I felt, that my pride was a casualty she was willing to sacrifice if it meant keeping her image intact. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while she scrolled on her phone beside me, my mind slipped back to all the other times she had chipped away at me. The flashbacks came unbidden, like old wounds reopening. I remembered the time I surprised her with a necklace on our 2nd anniversary. It wasn't from a luxury brand, but it was elegant and chosen with love. She had smiled when she saw it but then asked, almost immediately, Did you get this on sale? It looks inexpensive. The word inexpensive had burned, because I knew she meant cheap. I remembered a barbecue 2 summers ago, when one of her cousins asked why we hadn't upgraded our car yet. I had laughed it off, but she had leaned in and said, Oh, he likes to pretend we're still in college. You know, saving every penny. It's cute, until you realize it means driving that rust bucket around forever. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but inside, I was dying a little. And I remembered, most painfully, the night we fought over her dream of buying a bigger house. I had explained gently, carefully, that financially it wasn't the right time, that it was better to wait. She had snapped, You're always waiting. Always planning. Do you ever think maybe you're just afraid of success? Afraid because you'll never have it? Her words had cut me deeper than she knew, because I wasn't afraid of success. I just defined it differently. To me, success wasn't flaunting wealth. It wasn't chandeliers and custom table runners. Success was stability. Peace. Building a life that wouldn't crumble with one bad turn. But she didn't see it that way. To her, my restraint was weakness. My humility was poverty. And now, with Thanksgiving looming, she had found yet another way to make me feel small. But that night, as the memories swirled and the bitterness pooled inside me, something shifted. The pain was still there, raw and sharp, but beneath it was something else. A quiet fire. A resolve that hummed just below the surface. I whispered to myself in the dark, words she couldn't hear. You think I'm too broke to host Thanksgiving? You'll see. You'll see what I'm capable of. It wasn't anger alone that fueled me. It was the years of humiliation, the way she stripped me bare in front of her family, the way she thought money defined worth. I knew then that I wouldn't lash out with words or arguments. That never worked with her. She thrived on belittling, on feeling superior. No, if I was going to respond, it would have to be different. Silent. Patient. A move so unexpected that when it happened, she wouldn't know what hit her. And so, while she drifted to sleep beside me, scrolling until her eyelids grew heavy, I stared at the ceiling, my mind already spinning. I didn't have the full plan yet. But I knew this. I was done letting her laughter echo louder than my dignity. This Thanksgiving would not go the way she thought it would. I'll admit something to you right now, something I haven't said out loud in years. I've never been the type of man who flaunts what he has. Growing up, I didn't have much, and I learned very early that the world doesn't hand you anything for free. My father worked in a machine shop until his back gave out, and my mother cleaned houses on weekends just so we kids could keep the lights on. We didn't know the meaning of luxury. We only knew survival. And because of that, I carried a habit with me into adulthood. Whenever I earned, I didn't spend, I saved. And when I saved enough, I learned how to make my money work for me quietly, silently, while everyone else was showing off their cars and their watches and their vacations. You see, while my wife thought she had married a man who could never climb above his station, the truth was far different. Every paycheck, I set aside a portion. I didn't waste on gadgets, I didn't fall for trends, and I didn't need to show off to prove I was a man. Instead, I invested slowly, carefully. At first, it was just small amounts in mutual funds. Then real estate. Then, years later, a piece of a small trucking company owned by an old friend. Bit by bit, I built something quiet and steady. I never told my wife about this, not because I wanted to deceive her, but because from the very beginning, she had made it clear that what mattered most to her was not stability, not security, not loyalty, but appearances. She wanted the house her friends would envy. She wanted the luxury car that would gleam in the driveway. She wanted the designer bags and the vacations posted online for everyone to see. I could have given her those things. I could have, even back then, but I didn't, because I wanted to build something stronger than just a moment of attention. I wanted to build safety, freedom, and power, the kind that doesn't come from a handbag or a car. The kind that comes from knowing that, no matter what, you will always be fine. But she never asked. Not once. She never asked about my accounts, my investments, or my plans. She only saw the surface, the man who wore simple clothes, drove a modest truck, and didn't shower her with expensive gifts. And she decided that was all I was. The thing is, I let her believe it. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe, by staying quiet all those years, I gave her permission to write me off as too small for her world. But a part of me found it amusing. It was almost like a game. She would look down on me for being simple, and I would smile quietly, knowing the truth she didn't care enough to discover. But that night, after she mocked me in front of her family, after they laughed at the idea of me hosting Thanksgiving, something shifted. I sat in the living room when we got home, the lamp throwing a pale light across the room, and I stared at her as she scrolled on her phone, smirking at some meme her sister had sent. She didn't even realize how deep her words had cut. She didn't realize the humiliation of being called too broke by the woman I had given my life to. In that silence, my mind replayed other moments, flashes of a past I had tried to forget. Like the time, 3 years ago, when we went to her cousin's engagement party. I remember I wore my best shirt, pressed slacks, shoes I had polished the night before. I thought I looked respectable. But as we were driving, she leaned over and said, "Could you at least buy a proper blazer? Everyone else will be dressed like professionals, and you'll look like, well, you." I laughed it off at the time, but inside it stung. She didn't want me to look like me. She wanted me to look like someone else, someone who fit her world better. Or the Christmas when her father handed out envelopes with gift cards inside to all the kids and grandkids. He gave me a polite smile, then handed me a Home Depot card saying, "You can probably use this more than the others. I know you're the handyman type." I thanked him, but I saw the smirk exchanged between my wife and her sister. They thought it was funny. To them, I wasn't family. I was just the guy who fixes things. And the worst one, the night we went to dinner with her friends from college. I didn't say much. They all worked in finance, tech startups, law firms. The wine flowed, the laughter grew louder, and one of them asked what I did. Before I could answer, my wife jumped in with a laugh. "Oh, him? He's just the dependable type. Pays the bills, keeps the lights on. Not much of a dreamer." They all chuckled politely, but the look one of her friends gave me, that pitying look, as if I were invisible, burned into me. I swallowed all of it. Every jab, every cut, every insult. I told myself, she doesn't mean it. She just wants to impress her family. But as the years went on, the cuts piled up, and my silence became less about patience and more about endurance. So when she said those words at dinner, "He's too broke to host Thanksgiving," something inside me hardened. Not because it was the first insult, but because it was the last straw. That night, after she went to bed, I pulled out my old notebook, the one where I keep track of my investments, my holdings, my plans. I flipped through the pages, the neat columns of numbers, the steady growth, the evidence of years of discipline. And as I stared at it, I realized I didn't need to argue with her. I didn't need to scream or fight or try to prove myself with words. No, My actions would speak louder than anything. She thought she married a broke man. She thought I was small, invisible, beneath her family's notice. But soon she would see. They would all see. I closed the notebook, placed it back in the drawer, and sat in the darkness of the living room, a quiet smile spreading across my face. For years, I had been content to remain unseen. But now it was time to let the truth step into the light. And as I drifted to sleep in that armchair, one thought burned in my mind. Thanksgiving would not be the humiliation she expected. It would be the day everything changed. I remember that night so clearly because it wasn't just an ordinary evening. It felt like one of those moments where the universe was deliberately testing my patience. We had just finished a bland dinner at home, one of those quiet nights where I cooked something simple and my wife picked at her food, scrolling on her phone more than she actually ate. After we cleared the plates, she poured herself a glass of wine, and I sat down on the couch to check my emails. That's when her phone pinged. It was the dreaded family group chat. Now, if you've ever been in one of those giant family threads, you know how chaotic they can be. Dozens of messages flying in within minutes, people trying to outdo one another with jokes, updates, or in this case, plans. But my wife's family wasn't like mine. They weren't just sharing memes or checking in. Their group chat was a constant competition, a virtual arena where wealth, status, and appearances were flexed like trophies. I could hear the chime of messages coming in rapid fire, and I didn't even have to ask what it was about. My wife's smirk told me everything. "Looks like Mark's stepping up for Thanksgiving," she said, holding her phone like it was a diamond ring. Mark, my wife's older brother. If arrogance could be bottled and sold, he'd be a billionaire twice over. He had always lived in the shadow of his father's money, but instead of humility, it made him louder, flashier. He loved making everyone feel like they were beneath him. And of course, he adored reminding me that I was especially beneath him. "What's he saying now?" I asked, pretending not to care, though my stomach tightened. "Oh, you'll love this," she chuckled. "He's hosting this year. Says the mansion will finally do Thanksgiving justice since, and I quote, not everyone has the means to host properly." She looked right at me when she said it, just to twist the knife. I kept my face calm, but inside, I could feel that familiar burn of humiliation. It wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about the narrative they'd built around me. That I was the outsider, the poor man who somehow tricked his way into their pristine family tree. They never saw me for the man I was, just the wallet I supposedly didn't have. As more messages came through, my wife started reading them aloud. "Mom says she's glad it's at Mark's this year, since it'll be a step up from small dinners. Sarah, oh, you remember my cousin Sarah? She says she's excited to finally have a Thanksgiving worthy of Instagram." The words felt like darts, one after another. They weren't directly aimed at me, but the subtext was clear. Hosting at our home was beneath them. I was beneath them. I glanced at my wife, waiting for her to say something, anything, to defend me. But she didn't. Instead, she typed out her own contribution, her nails tapping gleefully against the screen. "Can't wait. It'll be so much better than squeezing into our little place." Our little place. That's how she described our home. Not our first house together. Not the place where we built our life. No, just a little place that wasn't good enough for her family's approval. I looked down at my hands, gripping the edge of the couch. I felt the sting of humiliation settling into my chest, but right beneath it was something sharper, resolve. I didn't say a word. Not when she read the group's jokes about finally doing Thanksgiving right. Not when she added another laughing emoji at my expense. I sat there, silent, because silence has a power most people underestimate. But while I stayed quiet, my mind wasn't. I thought about the years I had worked overtime shifts, the nights I stayed up late balancing spreadsheets and studying investment strategies. I thought about the weekends I skipped vacations or dinners out because I was saving, building, creating a future no one but me knew about. And I thought about how blind they all were, how they measured a man's worth by the size of his dining table or the shine on his car, never considering the strength of his character, his discipline, his vision. So while my wife's family was busy gloating in their digital echo chamber, I reached for my phone. At first, I opened it casually, as if I was just checking notifications. But the truth was, I already knew what I was going to do. I scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in a while, Mr. Jacobs, the manager of a fine dining restaurant downtown. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was one of those places where reservations had to be made months in advance, where every meal felt like an event, where the waiters knew your name before you even walked in. I stared at his number, my thumb hovering above the call button. Not yet, I thought. Timing was everything. Instead, I slid the phone back into my pocket and forced a smile. Sounds like everyone's excited, I said, my voice neutral. My wife nodded, sipping her wine like a queen. Of course they are. Mark knows how to do things right. Not like, well, you know. She trailed off with a smirk. I said nothing. But in that silence, a plan began to form. The next day, the family group chat was still buzzing. Plans were being made, menus, seating arrangements, decorations. Mark bragged about hiring a private chef. My wife chimed in with enthusiastic approval. It was as if the holiday had already become a showpiece for their vanity. I didn't comment. I didn't argue. I just listened, observed. And when I was alone, I made my moves. On my lunch break, I stepped outside my office and finally called Mr. Jacobs. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm, professional. Mr. Jacobs, I said, lowering my voice. It's been a while. I need a favor. Something big. There was a pause, then a chuckle. How big are we talking? Big enough to host a full Thanksgiving dinner for a large group. Private, elegant, unforgettable. I could almost hear his eyebrows raise through the phone. For you, I'll make it happen. But you'll need to give me details soon. That time of year books fast. I glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Consider it done. I'll send you everything tonight. When I hung up, a wave of calm washed over me. Not excitement, calm. Because this wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about playing their game. It was about reminding myself, and eventually them, that I wasn't the man they thought I was. That evening, while my wife was still laughing at Mark's latest brag in the group chat, I sat quietly at my desk, writing out the details. I told Jacobs I wanted the entire restaurant reserved. Every table, every chair, every light. It wasn't just a dinner, it was going to be a statement. And though my wife's family didn't know it yet, Thanksgiving this year wouldn't be at Mark's mansion. It would be at my table. As the days ticked by, the group chat grew louder, more boastful. My wife fed off it, parroting every arrogant line her brother said, laughing at jokes about finally doing it properly this year. But me? I stayed silent. I let them believe what they wanted. I let them underestimate me. Because nothing makes a reveal more satisfying than being completely written off first. And so, while they planned their little show, I prepared for mine. I had never done anything so daring, so utterly out of character for myself. Most of my life had been about restraint, about living within boundaries, about finding pride in being careful with money. But as I sat in my car outside the first high-end restaurant I decided to visit, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears like a drum. The polished windows reflected back the image of a man who, at least to his wife's family, was nothing more than too broke to matter. Yet inside my chest, behind the quiet gaze, was a storm. The restaurant loomed before me, draped in warm lights and golden accents that spilled onto the street, inviting and intimidating all at once. The kind of place where my wife's brother probably ordered wine without looking at the price. The kind of place her mother always said was too refined for someone like me to appreciate. I straightened my jacket, drew in a deep breath, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first: truffles, seared steak, fresh bread still steaming in its basket. The air was heavy with luxury, the sort that clings to your clothes long after you leave. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a stage, and every diner was part of the performance. Waiters glided like dancers, trays balanced effortlessly, voices hushed but authoritative. For a moment, I felt small again, as though I didn't belong, just like the first time I met my wife's family, and they looked at me as if I had wandered into the wrong room. But then I remembered the sneers, the laughter when my wife had said I couldn't even afford to host Thanksgiving. I remembered her brother leaning back in his chair, smirking, talking about how his mansion had a dining hall fit for kings. And in that memory, something inside me snapped into place. I walked to the host's stand, cleared my throat, and asked to speak with the manager. The man who came out wore a crisp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture stiff yet practiced. His smile was polite, but his eyes flickered with curiosity when I explained what I wanted. "I'm interested in booking the entire restaurant," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was hammering. For the first time, his professional mask slipped. "The entire restaurant, sir?" "Yes," I replied. "For Thanksgiving dinner. A private event." His brows lifted, but he quickly composed himself, as though he'd been trained not to look surprised at any request. He asked me to sit, offered me a glass of water, and began asking questions about the number of guests, dietary restrictions, timing, the flow of the evening. His tone suggested he wasn't sure whether I was serious, but the longer we spoke, the more he realized I wasn't here to play games. As he outlined the costs, I felt an old, familiar reflex tugging at me. The instinct to recoil, to say, "That's too much, I can't justify it." The voice of the man who had built his life on modest choices whispered in my ear, telling me this was wasteful, excessive. But then another voice rose up inside me, the voice of the man who had been humiliated by his own wife. The man who had been told he wasn't good enough, who had been laughed at in front of people, who never once bothered to understand his worth. I silenced the first voice. When I nodded and agreed to the terms, the manager's eyes widened ever so slightly, and in that flicker of surprise, I felt something shift inside me. For once, I wasn't the man shrinking in the background. I was the one making the room adjust to me. Leaving that restaurant, I felt a strange exhilaration, but also a gnawing doubt. Was this really the right move? Would anyone even appreciate it? Or would they simply twist it, as they always did, to make me seem foolish? But then I reminded myself, it wasn't for them. This wasn't about approval. This was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me, dignity. Still, something about that first restaurant didn't sit right with me. It was too small, too intimate. My wife's family would scoff at it, call it a cute attempt. I needed something grander. So I kept searching. For days after work, I would quietly slip into different restaurants across the city. Each time, I rehearsed the same conversation with the manager, walking in with an air of calm that belied the storm inside me. I toured ballrooms with ceilings painted in gold leaf, dining rooms with chandeliers dripping crystals like frozen rain, and kitchens buzzing with chefs who spoke in sharp, urgent tones. At each location, I paid attention not just to the decor, but to the feel of the place. How would it sound when 20 forks hit plates at once? How would the lighting look on the faces of those who had doubted me? Would the room itself silence their arrogance before I even spoke? Finally, after nearly a week of searching, I found it. It was a restaurant tucked into a historic building downtown, with arched windows that spilled light onto velvet drapes, and tables carved from dark mahogany that gleamed like polished mirrors. The moment I stepped inside, I knew it wasn't just beautiful, it was commanding. The kind of place where silence carried weight, where laughter echoed with power. The manager, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like silk, walked me through the details. She spoke of seasonal menus, of curated wine pairings, of private musicians who could be hired to play soft jazz throughout the evening. Every detail seemed to whisper the same promise: they won't forget this. When she quoted the final cost, I didn't flinch. I signed the paperwork, handed over the deposit, and felt the weight of secrecy settle over me like a cloak. Because here was the hardest part, I couldn't tell anyone. Not my closest friends, not the colleagues who trusted me, not even the small circle of people who actually respected me. If word slipped, if even the faintest rumor reached my wife or her family, the plan would crumble before it had a chance to bloom. So I carried the secret like a torch in the dark. Every night, lying in bed beside my wife as she scrolled through her phone, laughing at her brother's messages about how epic this Thanksgiving is going to be, I bit my tongue. Every time she tossed a snide comment my way, "Don't worry, honey, you won't have to lift a finger this year, my family has it covered," I smiled and nodded, my hands folded quietly, while inside me, the fire burned hotter. I found myself studying her face in those moments, the way her lips curled in superiority, the way she seemed utterly certain of her world. And in those quiet nights, I realized, what I was planning wasn't just a dinner. It was a mirror I was about to hold up to all of them. The secrecy weighed on me, but at the same time, it gave me a strange, electric energy. At work, when people noticed the extra spark in my step, I brushed it off as just a good week. When my wife asked why I seemed distracted, I told her I was stressed about deadlines. Each lie was a brick in the wall I was building around the truth. The night before Thanksgiving, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the reservation confirmation sitting folded in my nightstand drawer like a hidden weapon. My heart raced with both fear and anticipation. What if the plan went wrong? What if they laughed even harder? But then I pictured the look on their faces when they walked into that restaurant, expecting nothing from me, and I felt calm. Because no matter how they reacted, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't the man they thought I was. And come tomorrow night, they would finally see it. I still remember the way the house smelled that night, just faintly of cinnamon and pine from the candle my wife had lit earlier that week, a desperate attempt to match the holiday vibes she gushed her brother's mansion would surely provide. The living room was littered with half-open suitcases, clothes spilling over the sides like an overstuffed closet finally giving way. My wife was moving back and forth between our bedroom and the living room like a woman on a mission, muttering to herself about which outfits she needed for the perfect Thanksgiving family photo. She didn't ask me what I planned to wear, didn't so much as glance in my direction except to complain about how wrinkled one of her blouses had become. To her, this was her family's show, and I was just a background extra who should be grateful to be allowed on stage. I sat quietly on the couch, the television flickering in the background though I wasn't paying attention to it. My phone sat in my lap, black screen hiding the truth I'd been guarding so carefully these past weeks. On that phone were the confirmations, the private emails with the restaurant manager, the receipts of down payments I had wired, all under a veil of secrecy. My wife had no idea. Her family had no idea. They believed I was the broke husband, too weak, too insignificant to step up. And part of me relished that they thought so, because the quieter their arrogance became, the louder my actions would roar when the moment arrived. As she zipped up one of the bags, she looked at me with that familiar tilt of her head, the same one she always used when she wanted to drive in the knife. Do you even have a shirt decent enough for tomorrow? Honestly, maybe don't embarrass me by wearing that old blazer again. You'll look like the chauffeur instead of family. She laughed as if she'd cracked some hilarious joke. I didn't respond. I had learned by now that silence stung her more than any comeback I could deliver. But silence didn't mean passivity. My mind was humming, running over details like an orchestra tuning up before the symphony begins. I had confirmed the head count, double-checked the wine selections, even arranged for a dessert spread so decadent it would silence any critic. Every piece was set in motion like dominoes waiting for that first flick. And yet, as calm as I appeared on the outside, inside my chest my heart was racing, pounding like a drum that only I could hear. It wasn't nerves, at least, not entirely. It was anticipation. I was on the edge of something irreversible, something that could change the balance of this marriage, this family dynamic forever. Later that evening, she FaceTimed her mother while folding scarves into one of her smaller bags. I could hear her mother's voice through the speaker, rich with condescension even in the crackly audio. "Oh, darling, we'll have the most beautiful Thanksgiving. Your brother's chef has already planned the menu. It will make last year's dinner look like a child's picnic. You must be so relieved you don't have to rely on modest resources this year." Her eyes flicked toward me for just a second, smug and satisfied, before she responded with a sweet, "Yes, Mom. It'll be perfect. Thank goodness for my brother." That was the environment I was walking into tomorrow, a family armed with their smug laughter, their polished dining room, their rehearsed superiority. But that's what made it so thrilling. They had no idea I had been writing a different script all along. I excused myself quietly and stepped out onto the back porch, the night air cool against my face. I leaned on the railing, staring up at the dark sky speckled with faint stars. My phone buzzed with a message from the restaurant manager. "Everything confirmed for tomorrow. Staff will be ready. Happy Thanksgiving in advance." I read it twice, 3 times, as if to absorb the weight of what I had set in motion. A whole restaurant, ours for one night. A kingdom built not to flaunt wealth, but to remind those who mocked me that humility is not weakness. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and listened to the faint sounds of my wife's laughter inside. She was telling her sister how embarrassing it was to have a husband who can't even provide a proper holiday. Her words carried through the screen door like smoke, curling around me, bitter and sharp. And yet, rather than wound me, they only strengthened my resolve. I went back inside later, pretending to scroll through my emails while she fussed over jewelry. She kept asking herself out loud whether gold or silver would look better under the chandelier lighting in the mansion's dining room. I nodded absently, offering no real answer. My silence was beginning to irritate her. I could feel it in the way she slammed the closet door shut. But that was fine. Let her stew. Tomorrow, she would have no words. The night grew later, the house quieter. Our suitcases stood by the door like obedient dogs waiting for their leash. My wife finally collapsed into bed, satisfied with her packing but still murmuring about how wonderful tomorrow would be. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, feeling the gravity of the secret pulling at me. She had no idea she was falling asleep next to the very man who would rewrite the narrative she and her family had scripted. At some point, I drifted off too, but not before whispering the words to myself, a vow, a promise that crackled in the dark like electricity. Tomorrow they'll know. The morning of Thanksgiving broke cold and crisp, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains like a spotlight on a stage. My wife was up before me, clattering through the kitchen with her usual holiday rush, making coffee while muttering a running list of things to remember: chargers, perfume, the extra scarf she thought might be photogenic. She was buzzing with anticipation, her eyes gleaming, as though she were about to step into a world that validated everything she believed about herself and her family. I lay there for a moment, letting the warmth of the blankets anchor me, the quiet before the storm of the day I had orchestrated. My chest tightened, not with regret, but with the weight of inevitability. Today was the day. She had dressed to impress, as always, in a fitted cream-colored sweater and gold earrings that swung slightly when she moved. As she paced the living room, she kept glancing at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting and readjusting like she was preparing for a photo shoot. "We don't want to be late," she kept reminding me. "You know how my brother hates when people arrive after the appetizers are served." I smiled faintly, pulling on my jacket, hiding the storm behind my calm demeanor. If only she knew that her brother's appetizers, her brother's chandelier-lit dining room, her brother's pompous speeches, all of it was irrelevant today. The drive began with her chatter filling the car, a running commentary about how grand the mansion would look this year, about how the chef was probably finalizing the turkey glaze as they spoke, about how the entire family would gather in the marble foyer before moving to the dining hall. I let her words wash over me, hands steady on the wheel. Every mile that ticked by felt like another beat in the drumline of suspense building inside me. At some point, I cleared my throat. "Before we head over to your brother's, there's something I'd like us to do first. Just a quick stop." She frowned, her lipstick-red mouth tightening slightly. "Hey, stop. What do you mean? We don't have time for detours. My mother will be furious if we're late." "Trust me," I said evenly, eyes fixed on the road. "It won't take long. You'll see." She sighed heavily, rolling her eyes in that dramatic way she did when she thought I was being foolish. "Fine. But if we walk in late and everyone's already seated, I'm telling them it's your fault." The GPS on my dashboard quietly guided us toward the restaurant, though she didn't notice at first. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, checking the family group chat that was lighting up with messages. Her brother had sent a picture of the mansion's front steps, lined with autumnal decor captioned, "See you all soon at the palace." Her sister responded with clapping emojis. Her mother followed with, "Can't wait to welcome everyone for a Thanksgiving none of us will forget." The irony of those words wasn't lost on me. As we pulled into the restaurant's discreet driveway, the towering glass windows reflected the mid-morning light like jewels. The valet was already stationed at the entrance, immaculate in his uniform, waiting with the poise of someone trained to serve the elite. My wife glanced up from her phone, confusion knitting her brows. "Wait, why are we here? This is that place downtown, isn't it? We can't afford this. Did you take the wrong turn?" "No," I said calmly, handing the keys to the valet. "This is the stop I mentioned." She blinked at me, disbelieving. "Are you serious? We're going to be late for my brother's mansion. Whatever this is, can it wait?" I ignored her protests, walking toward the entrance. The heavy glass doors swung open as the maitre d' approached with a polished smile, bowing slightly. "Welcome. Your party has been prepared for." His words were smooth, professional, yet loaded with a weight my wife couldn't yet comprehend. She froze in the doorway, her heels clicking against the marble tile as she looked around. The restaurant was quiet, every table already set with crisp linens, gleaming silverware, and crystal glasses that sparkled like ice under the chandelier light. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with a faint hint of rosemary and garlic drifting from the kitchen. The entire dining room radiated quiet luxury, but there were no other patrons. Not a single stranger. Only space, empty tables waiting for guests who hadn't arrived yet. Her face flushed with irritation, masking the unease creeping into her eyes. She leaned toward me and hissed, "What is this supposed to be? Some kind of joke? Did you rent a table here just to prove something?" I said nothing, just let the silence hang as I adjusted my cufflinks. Her whisper grew sharper. "You can't seriously be trying to make a scene. My family is waiting at the mansion." But even as she spoke, I could see the flicker of doubt in her expression. The maitre d' was treating me with a kind of reverence she had never seen directed my way. The valet had opened my door with precision. The restaurant was eerily, impossibly empty except for us. Somewhere inside, a part of her must have realized this wasn't just me renting a table. We were escorted to the grandest table in the center of the dining room, a long table adorned with autumnal arrangements of deep red leaves, golden gourds, and flickering candles. Place settings stretched further than our party of two could ever need. She sat stiffly, arms crossed, glaring at me. I don't know what you think you're doing, but my family isn't going to be impressed by whatever this is. I leaned in slightly, my voice low, steady. We'll see. That was when her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, and I saw her freeze. Her brother had messaged the group. Strange, no one's here yet. Did we mix up the time? A few seconds later, her mother replied, Are we sure about the address? This doesn't feel right. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She looked at me, suspicion flaring. What did you do? I simply smiled, leaning back in my chair as a waiter arrived with a silver tray carrying 2 glasses of champagne. The bubbles rose and popped in perfect rhythm, a celebratory overture to a symphony only just beginning. Around us, the restaurant remained silent, waiting. The suspense hung in the air like a held breath. My wife's eyes darted from me to the door, to her buzzing phone, back to me again. Her confidence was cracking, disbelief carving lines into her face. She shook her head slowly, almost laughing but not quite. This is ridiculous. You're making a fool of yourself. My family is probably already seated at the mansion by now. But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. The maitre d' returned, bowing slightly. Sir, we are prepared for the rest of your party. Shall we be ready to receive them when they arrive? My wife snapped her head toward him, eyes wide. What? What do you mean, the rest of the party? I lifted my glass, swirling the champagne, meeting her gaze with quiet certainty. You'll see soon enough. Her lips parted, but no words came. The restaurant lights shimmered softly above us, the air thick with unanswered questions, and I could feel it, the shift. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. For the first time, she didn't know what was coming. And that, I thought, was the beginning of everything. The door swung open with a soft chime, and in that instant, it was as if time itself hesitated. The family, who had been muttering with annoyance, stepped inside the restaurant expecting a normal entryway, maybe a small dining hall or a crowded space buzzing with strangers who had Thanksgiving reservations of their own. Instead, they were met with silence, an elegant, deliberate silence broken only by the faint notes of a string quartet playing softly in the corner. The maitre d', dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, stood waiting with a gentle smile. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, and behind him, a team of servers in crisp white shirts and black vests lined up like soldiers ready for ceremony. The golden glow from the chandeliers washed over the room, illuminating polished mahogany tables dressed in cream linens, each adorned with delicate arrangements of autumn leaves and deep red roses. Welcome, the maitre d' said smoothly, his voice carrying the warmth of practiced hospitality. The restaurant is closed for the evening. It is reserved exclusively for you and your family. A stunned silence fell over the group. Forks of disbelief seemed to pierce through their arrogance all at once. The sister-in-law's jaw dropped slightly. The brother-in-law, mid-sentence about the square footage of his mansion, faltered and fell silent. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. They stopped tugging at sleeves and clinging to iPads, staring wide-eyed at the sheer spectacle. And then came the wife's reaction. At first, her lips curled into a smirk, as if she thought it must be some kind of elaborate joke. She rolled her eyes and gave a small, dismissive laugh. Oh, very funny, she muttered, glancing at her brother, expecting him to laugh along and expose the prank. But when she saw the maitre d' bow respectfully and the waitstaff step aside like a royal procession waiting for their sovereigns, her laugh cracked in the middle, fading into an awkward cough. This isn't, she stammered, her voice unusually high-pitched. Her eyes darted to me, sharp and suspicious. What did you do? I simply smiled, calm and unhurried. Why don't we take a seat? Dinner is ready. The family exchanged bewildered glances. My wife's brother squinted at me, trying to piece together the puzzle. You reserved this place? For all of us? Yes, I answered softly. Every table, every chair, every course on the menu tonight. All for this family. The words sank into the air like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock across every face. The maitre d' extended his arm, guiding them toward the main dining hall. As they walked, the waitstaff sprang into motion, pulling out chairs, pouring sparkling cider into crystal glasses, and placing delicate amuse-bouche plates at every setting. The aroma of roasted turkey and glazed ham drifted through the air, mingling with the sweet scent of pumpkin pie and cinnamon bread fresh from the ovens. The family sat stiffly, their arrogance melting into confusion. But my wife, she was frozen. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. Her eyes moved around the room, from the chandeliers to the spotless floors to the array of servers awaiting commands, and finally back to me. It was the first time in years that she looked at me without condescension. Instead, she looked unsettled, vulnerable, almost afraid. I pulled out her chair gently, a deliberate act of courtesy, and whispered near her ear, "Not bad for someone who's too broke to host, right?" Her face flushed crimson. She clenched her napkin tightly in her hands, eyes flickering nervously toward her parents and siblings. For so long, she had worn her superiority like a crown, belittling me for my supposed lack of wealth, mocking my frugality, parading her family's affluence as though it were hers. But here, in this grand hall I had quietly prepared, that crown slipped. The first course arrived. Plates of roasted butternut squash soup, drizzled with cream and garnished with toasted pumpkin seeds, were placed before each guest. The servers moved with precision, in perfect silence except for the clink of porcelain and silverware. It was a ballet of hospitality, and every movement reinforced the same message. This was no accident. This was planned. The brother-in-law cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim his authority in the room. "Well, I must say this is impressive. But it must have cost a fortune. Surely the restaurant made a mistake." "No mistake," the maitre d' replied before I could answer. "The gentleman here arranged everything weeks in advance. Every detail was planned according to his specifications." I watched the brother-in-law's expression falter. The arrogance in his tone melted into discomfort. He shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with me. My wife's mother whispered something to her father, their eyes narrowing slightly. They had always assumed I was a simple man who could barely keep up with their world of country clubs and luxury vacations. And yet, here I was, effortlessly outshining them in their own game. Throughout it all, I sat quietly, sipping my cider, letting the silence between courses do the talking for me. Every gasp, every sideways glance, every whisper was part of the revenge I had planned. Not loud, not angry, but quiet, calculated, and devastating. And as the music from the string quartet swelled into a soft crescendo, I turned my eyes toward my wife again. She looked pale, her usual sharp tongue silenced. For years, she had reduced me to the role of the broke husband, an embarrassment beside her wealthy family. But now, in this room where every candle flicker and every polished plate testified to my hidden strength, she looked small. I leaned back in my chair, my heart steady, my resolve firm. This was only the beginning. Tonight, I would let actions speak louder than every insult she had ever thrown my way. And tomorrow, the world she built on arrogance would begin to crack. The first spoonfuls of soup were met with hesitant silence, the kind of silence that presses on the room like thick fog. Crystal glasses clinked softly, the quartet's music floated gently above the murmurs of surprise, but underneath it all was a palpable unease. The family, my wife's family, sat with rigid postures, uncertain of how to reconcile their old perception of me with the new evidence staring them in the face. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. "This soup is incredible," one cousin murmured, lifting her spoon again. "So smooth, and the presentation. Michelin star level," another sibling muttered, not quite loud enough to be confident, but not soft enough to hide the awe. Then came the inevitable question, whispered like a secret meant to be overheard. "How much do you think it costs to close down an entire restaurant for a night?" The brother-in-law, who had spent the better part of his adult life equating his worth with his wallet, cleared his throat loudly. "Well, it must have cost a small fortune. Easily 5 figures, maybe 6. This sort of extravagance doesn't come cheap." He said it as if trying to assert some kind of authority, like naming the price would lessen the impact. But his tone carried no confidence. It sounded more like an attempt to convince himself that this couldn't possibly be as grand as it seemed. Across the table, I caught sight of my wife's father leaning back in his chair, running a hand slowly along the rim of his glass. His eyes studied me, not dismissive, not mocking, but searching. For the first time since I'd joined their family, there was a glint of respect. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his silent acknowledgement. Meanwhile, my wife's hands twisted in her lap under the table. I could see the white of her knuckles as she gripped the linen napkin too tightly. Her smile was forced, the kind of brittle expression that cracked if you looked too closely. Every time someone commented on the food, or whispered about the price. She shifted in her chair. "Don't get too carried away," she muttered suddenly, breaking the flow of quiet admiration around the table. Her voice had that defensive sharpness, a shield she used when she felt cornered. "It's just dinner. He probably saved up or—" She stopped herself, realizing how petty she sounded, and took a hurried sip of her cider to mask her embarrassment. The others didn't respond. Instead, they glanced at her with mild discomfort, then turned back to their plates. For years, they had laughed at her jokes about me, rolled their eyes when she complained about my supposed lack of ambition. But tonight, the balance was shifting. They saw something different. They saw that while she mocked, I acted. While she tore down, I quietly built. The second course arrived, a delicate plate of seared scallops resting on a bed of saffron risotto, drizzled with lemon butter. The aroma filled the air, making even the most skeptical family members pause with wide eyes. The servers placed the plates with grace, refilling glasses as though serving royalty. "Good heavens," her aunt whispered, taking a tentative bite. "This is divine." Her uncle nodded, chewing slowly, savoring the taste. "This isn't just dinner. This is an experience." I remained quiet, my expression calm, as though this were nothing extraordinary. I didn't gloat. I didn't boast. I simply enjoyed the meal with them, sipping quietly between bites. My restraint seemed to unnerve my wife more than any arrogance would have. If I had boasted, she could have rolled her eyes and dismissed it as typical male pride. But my humility left her with no ammunition. Her brother leaned forward finally, his voice lower, almost respectful. "I have to ask, how did you manage this? I mean, closing down the restaurant? They don't just do that." All eyes turned toward me. Even my wife, though she pretended to keep her gaze on her plate, tilted her head just enough to listen. I placed my fork down gently, dabbing my lips with the napkin before I answered. "It wasn't difficult," I said evenly. "All it took was some planning, a few conversations with the right people and priorities." I let the word linger in the air. Priorities. The implication was clear enough for anyone who wanted to hear it. While others spent their lives proving their wealth with cars, vacations, and jewelry, I had chosen something different. I had chosen moments that mattered. A few of them nodded slowly. The aunt who had complimented the food looked at me with softened eyes. "That's admirable," she said, almost to herself. My wife's fork clattered against her plate, a little too loudly. Her face turned red again and she muttered, "Admirable? Really? It's just one night. Don't act like it's—" She trailed off, realizing she was the only one trying to shrink the moment. The third course came, roasted duck with cherry glaze, served with truffle mashed potatoes. The family was quieter now, but it wasn't the same strained silence from the beginning. It was contemplative, almost reverent. They were eating slowly, tasting every bite, and occasionally glancing at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to newfound respect. The more the evening went on, the more I noticed the subtle shift. My wife's mother, who usually dismissed me with polite indifference, asked softly about the wine pairing. Her father, who never addressed me directly, raised his glass once in silent acknowledgement across the table. Even the children seemed to look at me differently, their young eyes reflecting the awe they felt at being treated like royalty. And my wife looked increasingly cornered. Each polite comment directed toward me, each nod of approval, each respectful silence ate away at the persona she had built. She had spent years painting me as inadequate, someone she tolerated rather than admired. Now, in front of the very people whose opinions she valued most, that story was unraveling. She leaned close to me at one point, her voice low and trembling with restrained anger. "What are you trying to prove?" I didn't look at her. I cut into the duck calmly, took a bite, and only after swallowing did I answer. "Nothing," I said softly. "I don't need to prove anything." The simplicity of the words struck harder than any elaborate explanation could have. Because they were true. I hadn't done this for her approval, or even for her family's. I had done it because I refused to live small under their shadow any longer. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she turned away, humiliated. By the time dessert was served, a trio of pumpkin cheesecake, pecan tarts, and cinnamon ice cream, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The family's conversations had grown more relaxed, laughter returning, but softened now with an undercurrent of respect. They no longer spoke over me or ignored my presence. Instead, they addressed me directly, asked questions, listened. It was subtle but powerful. The wife, however, barely touched her plate. Her fork rested on the edge, her eyes unfocused. Every laugh from her family that excluded her, every nod of respect in my direction, chipped away at her carefully constructed pride. She looked like someone standing in a crumbling house, holding the last brick as the walls collapsed around her. And I, calm, steady, unshaken, simply let the night unfold. For years, she had wanted me to feel small. Tonight, without raising my voice, without gloating, without a single insult, she was the one shrinking. And that, more than any speech, was the sweetest revenge of all. The clinking of silverware against china had quieted down by the time Aunt Marian leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms with a look of disbelief painted across her face. The glow from the chandelier reflected in her glasses as she tilted her head, narrowing her eyes like she was trying to solve a riddle that didn't quite make sense. "All right," she said finally, her voice cutting across the table. "This is all lovely, don't get me wrong. The food, the service, the spectacle of it all. But I've got to ask." She gestured with her fork, pointing at me like a detective about to interrogate a suspect. "How in the world did you pull this off? You mean to tell me you, of all people, rented out this entire place?" The table shifted into silence. Chairs creaked as relatives leaned in, hanging on to what might come next. Even the servers, though trained to remain professional, seemed to pause ever so slightly as they refilled water glasses, their ears tilted in my direction. My wife, seated rigidly 2 places away, shot me a sharp glance. It was the kind of look that could slice through steel, a mix of suspicion and panic. Her fingers tapped nervously against her wine glass, as though she already sensed what was coming, but wasn't ready to confront it. I let the silence linger, long enough for the weight of the question to settle over the table. Long enough for them to taste the discomfort in the air. Then calmly, I set down my knife and fork, dabbed the corners of my mouth with the linen napkin, and looked around at the faces watching me. Faces that had seen me as the quiet one, the outsider, the man not quite measuring up to their family's standards. "You want to know how?" I said softly, leaning forward just enough that my voice carried across the table. "All right, let's talk about it." A few eyebrows raised. My brother-in-law, the ever-arrogant host of Thanksgiving past, smirked like he was waiting for me to admit some kind of foolish debt or reckless gamble. My wife shifted uncomfortably, her lips tightening into a thin line. I drew in a slow breath. "The truth is, I've been saving and investing for years. Quietly. Consistently. I wasn't buying the flashiest cars. I wasn't trying to keep up with anyone's idea of what success should look like. I was building something real." A ripple went through the table. Some tilted their heads, confused. Others, like my father-in-law, narrowed their eyes as though trying to recalibrate the picture they'd had of me for years. "I lived simply," I continued. "I bought what I needed, not what I wanted. I worked hard, picked up extra hours when I could, and instead of spending every dollar, I invested. Real estate, stocks, a few side ventures that paid off better than I ever expected." Cousin Daniel blinked at me in surprise. "Wait, so you're saying you're, what, comfortable?" I allowed myself the faintest smile. Comfortable is one word for it. The silence grew heavier. My wife's face turned pale, her fork clattering softly against her plate as she set it down. "You're joking," she said quickly, her voice tight. "This is some kind of stunt. You can't possibly." "I can," I interrupted gently, my tone steady but firm. "And I did. This." I gestured to the room around us, the soft glow of the chandeliers, the rows of waitstaff standing by, the private dining experience unfolding like a royal banquet. "Isn't even a dent in what I've built. I've been patient. I've been disciplined. And I've been underestimated by almost everyone in this room." Gasps scattered across the table. Aunt Marianne's lips parted in shock. Even the brother-in-law's smug smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of disbelief. But it was my wife's reaction that held my attention most of all. She stared at me wide-eyed, her face contorting as though she were replaying years of conversations in her head. All the time she'd called me too broke. All the time she'd compared me to her brothers. All the time she'd dismissed my quiet efforts. "You never told me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All this time, and you never told me?" I met her eyes. "You never asked." The words hung between us like a thunderclap. She blinked rapidly, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her glass of wine, and took a shaky sip. The others at the table shifted in their seats, suddenly looking anywhere but at her. I leaned back, my expression calm. I didn't need to brag. I didn't need to prove myself with flashy toys or constant boasting. I believed that real strength, real success, doesn't always shout. It doesn't need validation. And maybe I thought maybe one day, you'd see the value in that. The cousin at the far end let out a low whistle. Man, that's wow. You've been sitting on this, what, for years? And just letting everyone assume. Yes, I replied simply. Because I don't live my life for anyone's approval. Not even my wife's family. I glanced toward my in-laws, whose proud, superior expressions had dissolved into something much more complicated. Shame, maybe. Respect, maybe. It was too early to tell. But why now? Aunt Marian pressed, her curiosity bubbling over. Why reveal it like this? I folded my hands on the table, speaking slowly, so they could all absorb it. Because sometimes silence lets people think they're right. Sometimes patience gets mistaken for weakness. And sometimes the only way to set the record straight is to let actions speak louder than words. Tonight was my way of reminding everyone, including my wife, that appearances can be deceiving. That humility doesn't equal poverty. That strength doesn't always look like what you expect. A stunned hush filled the room. Forks rested on plates. Glasses of wine sat untouched. Even the waitstaff seemed frozen, sensing the shift in atmosphere. My wife, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, finally shook her head. So all those years I thought you weren't enough, her voice cracked. You were more than enough. You just didn't. Didn't what? I asked quietly. Didn't trust me enough to share it? She snapped suddenly, her voice rising with a sharp edge of defensiveness. Heads turned. The family's eyes darted between us like spectators at a tennis match. I kept my tone measured. No, I trusted you. But I also knew what mattered to you most of all. Status. Appearances. Prestige. You've said it yourself countless times. If I had told you early on, would you have loved me for who I am, or for what I had? Her face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes, though whether from guilt or anger, I couldn't yet tell. She lowered her gaze, unable to respond. The table buzzed with low murmurs. Some relatives whispered to each other. Others looked at me with a newfound respect that hadn't been there an hour ago. The brother-in-law, clearly rattled, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and muttered something about luck under his breath, but no one picked it up. I sat back, breathing evenly, letting the truth settle like dust after a storm. For years, I'd lived in the shadow of their judgment, their arrogance, their assumption that I was too broke to ever match their standards. And now the truth had finally come out. But this was only the beginning. Because the question now wasn't whether I could afford this. It was how everyone, especially my wife, would live with knowing they'd been wrong all along. The silence that followed my confession lingered in the air, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on everyone's chest, heavy and suffocating, because no one quite knew what to say next. Forks that had been moving seconds ago now hovered midair, hands trembling slightly as if afraid to break the spell. My wife's face was pale, drained of the confident arrogance she had worn like armor for years. The woman who had once stood so tall, certain of her superiority, now seemed almost small in her chair, her eyes darting nervously from me to her family and back, as though searching desperately for a lifeline. But none came. Her brother, the one who had been boasting about his mansion, cleared his throat, his bravado suddenly muted. So, you've been sitting on this all this time? His voice cracked on the last word, betraying the disbelief he was trying to mask. His wife shot him a glance that said more than words could, something between scolding and awe. Across the table, my mother-in-law lowered her head, as if ashamed of the years she'd spent whispering about her daughter marrying beneath her. And then, slowly, as though someone had broken a seal, the murmurs began to spread. Cousins leaned closer, whispering about the restaurant, about the money, about how I'd kept quiet all these years. But in the middle of it all, my wife leaned closer to me, her voice low, almost trembling. Why didn't you tell me? It was not anger, not at first. It was something rawer, something closer to fear. I kept my tone even measured, because this was not the moment for raised voices. Because you never asked, I said softly. And every time you assumed I was less than you, less than them, you made it very clear you didn't care to know. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the words, as if trying to push away the years of belittlement that now played before her eyes like a cruel slideshow. The countless times she had dismissed my ideas, laughed at my practicality, whispered to her mother that I was too simple, too frugal. Now those moments weighed heavy in the air between us. Her father, usually stoic and quiet, finally spoke, his voice gravelly with age. Son, he said, and I noticed for the first time in years that he used the word son. I misjudged you. We all did. I owe you an apology. His words carried a gravity that made the room shift. Heads nodded in reluctant agreement, and one by one, members of the family began to echo the sentiment. "We're sorry. We didn't know. We were wrong." But my wife, her apology came differently. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the dessert was half eaten, she pulled me aside, away from the prying eyes of her family. Her hand clutched at my sleeve, tight and desperate, like a woman grasping at something slipping away. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't let this change us. Don't let this destroy us. I was wrong. I see that now. I was blind and cruel, and I never should have treated you that way. But please, please don't leave me." Her eyes glistened with tears, real tears, the kind I hadn't seen from her in years. For a moment my heart softened, because beneath the arrogance and the cruelty there was still the girl I once fell in love with, the girl who had laughed with me when we had nothing but second-hand furniture and late-night takeout dinners. But that softness was quickly tempered by the weight of everything she had done since then. "You didn't just treat me poorly," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "You let everyone else treat me poorly, too. You sided with them when you should have stood with me. You made me feel like less in my own home. And now that you know the truth, now that you see I was never too broke, suddenly you're sorry. But are you sorry because you hurt me, or because you're embarrassed in front of them?" The words seemed to hit her like a blow. She stumbled back a step, her hand slipping from my sleeve. For the first time in years, she had no sharp retort, no cutting remark. Just silence. Her shoulders shook as she pressed her hands to her face, muffling a sob. I stood there, my own chest heavy with a storm of emotions, anger, sorrow, disappointment, and the faintest flicker of hope. I had dreamed of this moment, of her realizing her mistake, of her begging for forgiveness. But now that it was here, it felt hollow. Could years of wounds be healed with a few desperate tears? Could trust be rebuilt when it had been eroded one insult at a time? The rest of the family pretended not to notice the confrontation, though their eyes betrayed their curiosity. A few whispered, others exchanged uneasy glances. They were seeing a marriage fracture in real time, and it made them uncomfortable. For years they had mocked me, and now they were watching the very foundation of their arrogance crack. Later that night, after everyone had left the restaurant and we returned home, the silence in the car was deafening. My wife kept glancing at me, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. When we stepped into the house, she finally broke down completely. She fell to her knees, clutching my hands, sobbing. "I don't deserve you. I see that now. Please, just give me one more chance. I'll change. I swear I'll change." And I, standing there in the dim glow of the porch light, had to make a choice. The man in me who still remembered love wanted to pull her up, to forgive, to believe in redemption. But the man who had endured years of humiliation, the man who had sat silently through insult after insult, was not so easily swayed. I didn't answer right away. I simply looked at her, my heart a battlefield of rage and compassion. "I need time," I finally said, my voice steady but firm. "Time to decide if forgiveness is even possible. Time to see if your words mean anything beyond this night." Her sobs quieted, but the fear in her eyes remained. She nodded slowly, knowing that her fate rested not on her wealth, not on her family's approval, but on the one thing she had always underestimated me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while she wept softly beside me, I realized something profound. Revenge had never truly been my goal. I hadn't booked the restaurant to humiliate her. I had done it to reclaim my dignity, to remind myself that I was never what they said I was. And whether or not she stayed in my life, one thing was clear: I would never again allow anyone to make me feel small. The restaurant had grown quiet after the storm of emotions. Plates had been cleared, the last glasses of wine were half finished, and the once arrogant voices of my in-laws had softened into murmurs. It was as though the grandeur of the evening had stolen away their entitlement, leaving them with nothing but humility and silence. I sat there, at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the white linen cloth, my face composed. For years I had swallowed my pride, bent my back to keep the peace, and let others think of me as the broke man who somehow married above his station. Tonight, that illusion had shattered. But the real reckoning had only just begun. My wife sat beside me, her face pale, her lipstick smudged from where she had nervously pressed her napkin against her trembling lips. Her eyes darted between me and her family, as though she didn't know which battlefield she belonged to anymore. For so long she had worn her family's arrogance like armor, but tonight, that armor was cracked. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I turned my head slowly to look at her. There was no anger in my eyes, no smugness, just a quiet steadiness. Would you have listened if I had? Or would you have laughed, just like you always did? Her eyes flickered downward, and for the first time in years, she didn't have a comeback. No sharp remark. No belittling laugh. Just silence. Across the table, my brother-in-law cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Well," he muttered, "I suppose we misjudged you." His wife added quickly, "We're sorry. It's just, you never said anything. We thought." "You thought I was beneath you," I interrupted gently. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the table. Every head turned toward me. "You thought money was the only measure of worth. And because I didn't flaunt it, you decided I had none." No one argued. It was in that moment I realized the power of silence, how it could cut deeper than any insult. My quietness over the years had been mistaken for weakness, but tonight it had revealed itself as strength. After dinner, as the family filtered out of the restaurant, some shaking my hand with newfound respect, others unable to meet my gaze, I remained behind with my wife. The clatter of dishes being cleared by staff echoed in the distance, but between us, the air was thick with unfinished words. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it back slowly, folding my fingers together instead. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "I was wrong. All these years, I belittled you, made you feel less, when you were more than I ever deserved." I stared at her, studying the woman I had once adored, the woman whose love had once been my anchor, but had slowly turned into a storm that battered me at every turn. "Do you even realize," I asked softly, "how many nights I lay awake, wondering if I was enough for you? Not because of who I was, but because of how you made me feel? Every time you laughed at me in front of your family, every time you told me I wasn't good enough, you chipped away at us." Her tears finally spilled over. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I hate myself for it. I thought I was protecting appearances. I thought that was what mattered. But tonight, you showed me what truly matters. Humility. Strength. Dignity. I don't want to lose you." There it was, the plea. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe her words and hope that tonight's revelation would spark change. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of ridicule and pain, wasn't so sure. Could someone who had treated me like an accessory truly learn to respect me as an equal? I stood slowly, pulling my jacket over my shoulders. She rose too, panic flashing in her eyes. "Please," she said, clutching my sleeve. "Don't walk away from me. Not tonight. Not like this." I looked down at her hand, then back at her face. "I'm not walking away," I said evenly. "But I am walking forward. Whether you come with me depends on you. This isn't about money, or restaurants, or proving a point. It's about respect. It's about love. And if you can't give me that, then no amount of apologies will matter." She nodded through her tears, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before: fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of facing herself. We left the restaurant together, but the silence between us wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of reckoning. As I drove us home, the city lights flashing across the windshield, I thought about everything that had led to this night. The years of patience, the quiet sacrifices, the insults endured. And I realized something profound. Sometimes revenge isn't about shouting, or fighting, or humiliating others. Sometimes the best revenge is simply standing in your truth, and letting the truth speak louder than any words. That night, as we pulled into our driveway, I knew the future was uncertain. Maybe my wife would change. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than money: my dignity. And that, in the end, was enough. Life teaches us that not every battle needs to be fought with anger. Sometimes silence, patience, and quiet strength reveal more than shouting ever could. My wife thought I was too broke to host Thanksgiving, so I rented the entire restaurant. And in doing so, I reminded her, and her family, that worth isn't measured by wealth but by dignity. Sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting. It's showing the truth. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story touched you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place?